Hello everyone and welcome to yet another tactical analysis video on my channel in yet another format. So as always, let me know what you think in the comments below. This time it's the Manchester derby between Guardiola's City and Mourinho's United. Those of you who are already subscribed will probably be aware that I've been on a bit of a hiatus away from YouTube, so hopefully this video won't be too rusty. Don't forget to hit the like button, and of course if you're new here, hit the subscribe button as well. No surprises from either side. City lined up in their regular 4-3-3, or 4-1-4-1 as some people like to look at it, with Fernandinho in the space between the central playmakers and the defence. Aguero, who's been in fantastic form in the build-up to the game, began up front in the centre, and Sterling and Mahrez were out wide on both wings. United, meanwhile, played more of a defensive 4-2-3-1. Some may argue it's a 4-3-3, but the reality is there's not that much difference. Where Fellaini was the midfielder, with more of a licence to push forwards to provide support for the lone Marcus Rashford up front, with of course the in-form Anthony Martial to his left and Jesse Lingard to his right. Lukaku was on the bench, of course, and Pogba wasn't in the squad at all, apparently, because he got injured midweek in Turin away at Juventus. Off the ball, City kept their shape and did what they usually do. They aimed to become slightly more compact, whilst one of the midfielders, in this case most of the time it was Bernardo Silva, aimed to drop a little deeper than David Silva alongside Fernandinho, if possible partnered with an organised pressing game over the pitch. Man City more than often looked to try and basically pressure their opponents in towards the wide areas, and it's not unusual to see at times wingers surrounded by not only a Man City fullback but one of the playmakers as well, and Fernandinho deciding to also join in on some of the action. The idea for City really defensively is to play a high line, constrict the space the opposition have to play within themselves, and City want to win the ball back closer to the opponent's goal to allow them to transition and counter-attack. United, meanwhile, defensively dropped into more of a flat 4-5-1, with all the front three dropping deep when required to support United's low block and deep defensive line, also known as Jose Mourinho's bus. When City attacked and tried to play out the back, Rashford kept the pressure on the centre-backs, and or Fernandinho, depending on the situation. Where required, Fellaini would also step forward to pressure Fernandinho, but it was quite inconsistent, just like the rest of Man United's pressing all over the pitch. Lingard would try to stop the passing option to Mendy and likewise Martial to Walker. However, due to Ederson's phenomenal passing ability for a goalkeeper, and City's numerical dominance within this area of the pitch still, plus the fact that they've really kind of become used to opponents trying to close them down from the front, Rashford obviously can't cover both centre-backs simultaneously, meaning one was always an option. And we all know how good ball-playing defenders both Laporte and John Stones are. And in the rare scenario where neither Dilva or Bilva would drop deep, or Sterling or Mahrez would then make themselves available in the wide areas by dropping deep into their own half, where they then wouldn't be followed by Ashley Young or Shaw. And Ederson's passing ability would then mean he could easily find one of the two wingers as a rare unmarked passing option, but we didn't actually see that happen too often because it genuinely was that easy for Man City to just pass it out of the back, or, you know, for either Bilva or Dilva to drop deep and not get followed all the way into their own half by the players that were man-marking them. As we've discussed on numerous occasions on this channel, a huge part of how Guardiola's teams play, especially the City side, is aiming to get his attackers to make runs into the half spaces. I'll link a video in the description where we look at Guardiola's Manchester City in more detail, so if that interests you, definitely check it out. But for those that might not know, the half space area is roughly the space often left between centre-back and his accompanying fullback, highlighted in front of you. And the ultimate goal is to try and get the attacker into the half space in a position where they can then get in behind a defender or be in a very dangerous position to play a final killer ball in an area of the pitch where they become very, very difficult for defenders to pick up. And that's the half space, really, in a nutshell. Knowing this, Mourinho employed his man-marking strategy, ensuring that Herrera stuck tight to Dilver at all times and likewise Matic to Bilver. He employed a similar approach against Guardiola's City last season in their win at the Etihad Stadium, and so did Jurgen Klopp in Liverpool's 4-3 victory over City, which we also analysed, and there will also be a link to in the description below. I think, if I remember correctly, that game was De Bruyne and Gundogan playing as the playmakers for Manchester City, and they were being man-marked themselves by, I think it was Oxlade Chamberlain and Wijnaldum. But anyways, Mourinho also instructed both of the Man United fullbacks to pressure and stay tight to Sterling and Mahrez whenever an attack was mounting. And given United's deep line, this was quite problematic, as it meant the fullback would always vacate the space behind them to push forwards towards that winger. And if United were playing with a higher line and they were further up the pitch, this would be obviously less of a problem. So in order to counteract this, last season Guardiola utilised Sterling centrally as a false nine to drop deep. That would then help them create overloads and a numerical dominance in the middle of the park, but to also distract the man markers to allow one of the Silvers to then make a run in behind or out wide, which would result in one of the wingers, for example, then making a run inside. The idea really is not just to maintain possession for the sake of maintaining possession, but with possession comes game control, which gives City's players time to make runs off the ball and resultantly open space up for each other, and it makes them a nightmare to mark. And obviously, when there's quite a lot of man marking and tight marking in play, this can cause problems. With both Man United centre-backs clearly being instructed to sit tight and not act as stoppers and push forwards, like, for example, what we saw Stones do for Man City a lot during the match, where he would sometimes, when required, sometimes, for example, to stop a counter-attack, would push forwards in front of Laporte and join Fernandinho almost as like a second midfielder and push the play, where he'd obviously vacate space behind him, but, you know, it's a tactical move to try and stop the attack. From the Man United side of things, it meant that Aguero, who was playing the false nine, would not get followed as he'd drop into midfield. And this really is a simple example of where City can easily create an overload in midfield down the left-hand side, and through Aguero's movement, as you can see from the diagram, then occupy Herrera, whereas Herrera's job was to try and man-mark Silva. So now suddenly Herrera needs to deal with an extra man, needs to deal with Aguero, who's dropped deep. Likewise, Sterling's movement can occupy Young, and therefore room in the half space is essentially born for David Silva. Now, this is a very simplified example, but it shows that players who are moving off the ball for Man City are just as responsible for creating the attacking move as the players with the ball. Due to United tightly marking City's players defending deep and narrow, this worked in favour of Man City, who like to use their wingers to keep the pitch as large as possible. Many teams opt to tuck in their wingers and use fullbacks for width, but with City, they adapt Walker and Mendy based on their opposition. And Guardiola knew United's game plan was to play long balls forwards behind the City high line into the wide areas. So for this reason, Walker and Mendy would look to really try and be as conservative as possible and play more as inverted fullbacks. This was a blessing, though, for players like Mahrez, because it meant that he could stay out wide, but also receive the switch of play often. So City have such good playmakers in the middle of the park. Despite everything Man United were doing, they were struggling, really, to win their tackles, and it was a very easy case of switching play for Man City. This meant City could still form dangerous attacks despite the playmakers, who are normally the dangerous men, centrally being man-marked. And a massive part of this as well was the fact that United were defending so narrow that it left, you know, that room on the opposite side of the park for City to exploit. Sterling and Silva also had phenomenal movement and variation down the left-hand side. You only have to watch the game to really see that. It's scintillating, really. We covered Aguero being willing to drop deep into the midfield to occupy the midfield and create room for the Silvers earlier, just how Sterling played the false nine role when the two teams last met last season. However, Sterling and Silva freely swapped positions too in this case. Herrera would sometimes still try to follow David Silva even when he'd drop deep or drag out wide, but this would obviously then just open room centrally for Sterling to then come inside. And that obviously left Ashley Young in a bit of a weird scenario because he either then has to follow Sterling centrally, which wasn't what he was doing, which leaves a lot of room in the middle of the park, and then it leaves Herrera having to stop man-marking David Silva. And I think I need to stop talking now because it's pretty obvious where this is going. But the TLDR really is that City's movement was just far too fluid to be resolved through merely man-marking. And it's not really because the man-marking is an incorrect approach. It is just genuinely a compliment of how good this Manchester City side is and how hard they work for each other off the ball. United's man-marking meant that City were essentially dictating the position of their opponents. Man-marking can work well, and we've seen it work well for Mourinho against teams like Chelsea, for example, where Herrera last season was trusted to deal with Hazard. However, in this case, there were just too many players focusing on following other players around the pitch that it became more of a hindrance for him. So when City would be playing out the back, it meant that the space often between the United back four and midfield would be vacated because Herrera and Matic are dragged further forwards towards the Silvers, who are basically making themselves passing options for Fernandinho and the centre-backs and the full-backs for build-up play, and that leaves the hope that Fellaini isn't trying to cut out the pass to Fernandinho, which wasn't the case, because United at times were trying to pressure City when they were playing out the back, but the problem was you could just tell from watching it that there was no cohesion in the Man United press. There were times where some players would press, which was really useless if other players don't simultaneously press, in comparison to a gegenpress, as we see Liverpool press as a unit, because you can press in one area of the park, but if no one's pressing the other passing option, then it's an easy passing option and all you're doing is wasting your stamina. So really, it was an example of where you could tell that the players, it was potentially something they may have worked on the training ground, but it just wasn't a new sudden style of play or defensive off-the-ball approach that they could have really picked up in a few training sessions, and it looked very, very, very off and unnatural. So on screen, we see a scenario where Aguero's the false nine was absolutely phenomenal. And as we covered before, due to the deep line that United had and the reluctance of the centre-backs to push forwards, he would often find himself being able to use the acres of space that essentially was left in front of Man United's back four, because those defensive midfielders would get dragged away by Bilva and Dilva, by the Silvers. And as soon as someone like a Fernandinho, who picks the ball up off Ederson, off the centre-backs, is able to essentially negate the Man United defence with a single pass and find Aguero in all that space, Aguero's more than just a finisher, he's more than just a striker. He's one of the best strikers on the planet, because not just because of his finishing, not just because of his goal-scoring ability, but because of everything else that he brings to the table. His ability to pass, his ability to spot a pass, his ability to dribble, his hold-up play, which is phenomenal for his size. And given how easy it was to get that ball up the pitch for Man City into that space where Aguero would drop deep and pick it up, that then allowed City to transition very quickly and with ease, and like I said, negate Man United's midfield a lot of the time, which was essentially should have been there to protect the defence, but it wasn't. So this is another example where Aguero's movement into the midfield can also create space to be exploited by the City playmaker or winger on the opposite flank. And we saw this happen a couple of times where Fernandinho was often able to play long passes along the ground through into this area to get picked up quite easily. It's really an example of the issue where if you focus too much on defending individuals, you, as a result, may sometimes leave vacated areas on the pitch in dangerous areas. And that's why I was saying that really man marking has a place and time, but it can be argued that United may have overdone it this time round. A big exploit City have done since last year is aim to create overloads on one side of the pitch against teams who defend deep and narrow, then aim to switch plays we covered early on. But this also includes aiming most crosses towards the back post. In fact, if you watch Aguero's positioning for crosses in the box this season, and I know this because I play fantasy football, which means I watch a lot of Aguero because I have him up front, you'll notice he most of the time drops towards the far post and is sometimes being followed up by one of the two playmakers. City's wide players have mastered the in-swinging, dipping, crossing style towards the back post because it not only negates City's lack of height by naturally surpassing most large defenders that are trying to defend a cross in the middle of the box or any large midfielders like a Matic, but also because it's an absolute nightmare to defend against. They're fortunate to be able to master such a technique because of the individual technical quality their players possess. It's similar to whipped crosses, that are played kind of into that area, swung into that area between the defenders in the box and the goalkeeper, which makes it so difficult to defend against. It's a very, very similar technique. And both City's first and third goals were scored through the same type of in-swinging, dipping cross style towards the back post. Riyad Mahrez was also an unsung hero at times throughout the match, and it showed with his off-the-ball movement for City's second goal. With City counter-attacking, he was intelligent enough to come central and drag Luke Shaw, who was marking him tightly. And again, this was the case for both Luke Shaw and Young, in terms of marking both the Man City, both Sterling and Mahrez, tightly at all times. And, was it effective? You tell me. I think the scoreline speaks for itself. This forced Lindelof to then come out and try and meet Aguero as this was happening, who then couldn't keep up with the Argentinian and made a big mistake initially by turning back towards Mahrez when the initial pass, the 1-2, was played. And that obviously slowed Lindelof down because he obviously had his feet jumbled up and meant he had to turn around again. Mahrez was intelligent enough to come central, use his off-the-ball movement to then create the space for Aguero and also play the 1-2 back to him. Again, it's another example of how important City's off-the-ball movement was to create space for each other, but also why Mourinho's man-marking approach for the defensive midfielders and fullbacks may not have been ideal. The third goal, despite being from a great ball and the movement having been put together over 44 passes, was an incredibly weak goal to concede. And it says it all when it goes past Smalling, Lindelof and Matic. Yet Gundogan somehow not only had time to hit the back of the net, but also had time to bring the ball down. And it was, from a Man United's perspective, I think they'd be incredibly disappointed to concede a goal like that. But again, it was another example of that type of dipping and swinging cross that we spoke about. So in terms of United's problems, Mourinho obviously opted to go with a deep defensive line and low block. And obviously, if you compare it to the exact same game at the Etihad where Man United, even if it was fortunate, won in the end, United actually played with a much higher defensive line that game, which made it a lot more difficult for Man City to play their game. And if you go back and compare both matches, you'll see that the game last year was actually quite even at times, despite United obviously throughout the season not showing form as well as Man City did, and which is obviously why Man City emerged as champions in the end. But the actual game itself, Man United put up much more of a fight. The game on the 11th of November 2018, there's no point anyone kidding themselves. It was men against boys. And, Man United's incohesive pressing, it just allowed City far too much time on the ball. City just made it look incredibly easy. And a lot of people were saying on another day it could have been 5 or 6. Well, City came into this game having won 2 games on the trot, 6-1. And City are a team that can put 6 goals past an opposition. And on another day, they very well may have been able to put 6 past Man United, given how well they were playing, given how much possession they had as well. And really, from a neutral's perspective, it was almost a good thing that Lukaku came on, made the run in behind, some fresh legs, caught City sleeping a little bit, forced a mistake out of Edison, and got that penalty back because it actually made a game out of it. Because trying to watch the game as a neutral, United weren't in the game. I tried to watch United play against Bournemouth the week before, and that was painful as well. Painful in a sense that United, at the moment, most of their passes are direct. They're struggling to retain possession, and it's appalling. They had no service to Rashford, Martial, Lingard and co. on the counter-attack. Matic, Fellaini and Herrera in midfield. Where exactly is the creativity meant to be coming from? Particularly when 2 out of those 3 are really mainly focused on their defensive duties and following an opposition player around. And when United did win the ball back, they were just far too deep, because obviously Rashford was dropping back to try and cover Fernandinho, and you had the 2 wide players in Martial and Lingard also, in a way, trying to make themselves options, but also in a way trying to provide some sort of hindrance against the overlap or the underlap coming in from Kyle Walker or Mendy. So when United won the ball back, despite City's high line, yes, there was a lot of space left behind City's high line, but what's the point when there's no one there to actually exploit it? And the only time they did manage to exploit it, or the 2 times they did, was actually through Lukaku, and they won the penalty through one of them. And another poor thing as well from Man United, in the first half, even when they were 1-0 down, in the second half, even when they were 2-1 down, there was a significant reluctance where, obviously they look to attack through the wide areas. Mourinho's teams have always tried to, attack down the wide areas and utilise pace and wingers and counter-attack and so on. It's natural that you attack down those sides, but in contrast to what we've discussed today from Man City, where they would always have the option of the overlap, be it the winger or the fullback or the wingback or whoever on the opposite side, to stretch play and provide an option to switch, it was very rare that United actually had that. And if they did have that, then they would have asked more questions of the Man City defence. With regards to Gundogan's goal, obviously we all know that Man City played 40 odd passes, and it was a great move really. But it's a Manchester derby. You're 2-1 down, you're Manchester United, and you're chasing an equaliser with minutes left. There wasn't even a single challenge from the United players. There was no energy, no closing down, no passion, no commitment. And there's only so much detail you can go into on a YouTube video in a tactical analysis, but at the end of the day, in football, the fundamentals have to be right. And they just weren't. It's as simple as that. And when you come up against a team like Manchester City, well, they will make you pay the price. It seems to me like Mourinho sends Man United, especially, it could be some sort of paranoia this season, where Mourinho's always been a defensively minded coach, and you look at his record with Chelsea when he won the Premier League the first time round, you see the amount of clean sheets they had, it was ridiculous, the lack of goals they conceded and so on, and he's always been that kind of manager where he believes that, if you can keep a clean sheet, build on that. And it looks like with United leaking goals left, right and centre, and there's a lot of emphasis obviously on the fact that Mourinho apparently wanted to bring in a centre-back in the summer, despite, the centre-backs that they already do have. And I think he signed Bayer as well, and he's obviously signed Lindelof. Their tactical approach really focuses mainly on so much on trying to not concede that when they do get the ball, to me it just looks like they don't know how to attack. If they get lucky, they eventually win a second ball, or they're able to build an attack against the weaker sides in the Premier League. They get the ball out wide, and they give it to someone like a Martial, they give it to someone like a Lingard, or Rashford who's out wide, none of which are natural wingers, none of which, are phenomenal passers of the ball, none of which are able to play across like we saw from Bernardo Silva for that third goal. And it's almost just like somewhat David Moyes-esque. When he managed United, there's a funny video on YouTube somewhere of David Moyes' United, which was cross after cross after cross after cross after cross. And I guess you can get away with it somewhat when you've got Lukaku in the middle. But there's a lot of the time where Lukaku has to drop so deep because United's midfield sometimes is just so non-existent that by the time the cross goes into the box, even Lukaku himself isn't there. And obviously, due to the man marking and the sitting deep, it created loads of space for Fernandinho to pick the ball up off the centre-backs, to play those balls through the midfield into Aguero, as we saw. And he had a phenomenal game. And one thing Fernandinho is great at doing is defending against teams that want to counter-attack him. He always provides that extra bit of protection for the centre-backs. The high line that City play obviously helps as well. And, you know, yes, it means he gets booked a lot, but if I was a centre-back and he was playing in front of me, he would be the person I'd want playing in front of me, basically. And like I said, United were completely outclassed. Sterling, Bernardo Silva, like, these are attacking players, but they were never hesitant in tracking back. And when they were tracking back, they were winning tackles. I think it was Martin Tyler that mentioned that. And that was in stark contrast to United's attackers. And the thing is, people always talk about, you know, United's results being poor. But you need to be honest with yourself. If you compare Walker and Mendy to Shaw and Young, Luke Shaw, I mean, okay, Luke Shaw is still young and obviously has had injury problems. But Ashley Young is like a converted winger. He has a good game every now and then, but he's not a world-class fullback or wing-back. Are we going to seriously sit here and compare Aguero, who's up there with your Shearers and your so on, in terms of Premier League goals scored, and heck, even Champions League goals scored, with a Lukaku or a Martial or a Lingard? You know, you're essentially comparing players that are in a different league to each other. Are we going to seriously sit here and compare the abilities of David Silva and Bernardo Silva in terms of their technical ability, their movement off the ball and so on, with the likes of Herrera, Fellaini and Matic? I mean, Fellaini, I'm not even sure what Fellaini is. Under David Moyes at Everton, he started off as more of a defensive midfielder and then realised he could play as an attacking midfielder, and at Man United he's kind of some sort of donkey that gets thrown on with 10 minutes to go up front to try and win second balls. So if you want to call him a midfielder, fair enough, but he's no way got the technical ability of a David Silva or Bernardo Silva. With all due respect to Herrera and Matic, they're more defensive midfielders. So where's United's creativity in the middle of the park going to come from? You think about players like Carrick, like Scholes, Pogba. Well, on paper, Pogba should be able to provide that, but for whatever reason, he isn't. And this is where you get into the conversation of, is it the manager's fault or is the team not good enough? And I think it's a mixture of the two. So Mourinho said the goals conceded were sloppy, and he tried to come up with excuses like, well, Man City obviously won 2 games, 6-1. Coming into this, they were mentally in a better state and whatnot. And look, I agree that Man United were missing Pogba, and so on. But for me, the real question is, even if Man United had Pogba, even if Man United started with Alexis Sanchez, if that even is his real name anymore, I'm not quite sure where the real Alexis Sanchez has disappeared to, would it really have made a difference? I'm not too sure. And you just have to be brutally honest. And Mourinho says ignore stats, but you have to look at the stats. And Man City probably didn't even get out of second gear to play the way they did. So potential solutions, again, this is just me theorising. Obviously, we saw Klopp employ a similar man-marking approach. I spoke about it earlier with Oxlade Chamberlain Wijnaldum, when they man-marked De Bruyne and Gundogan that were playing those kind of playmaker roles. The difference really was that Liverpool, they always gegenpress. The pressing was all over the park. It was consistent. And like I said, there's no point pressing one player if you've not got your teammate pressing the other passing option. And that's really what went wrong for Man United a lot of the time. And it's just clear that it's not something they've worked on. It's something they tried to do, brought into the game. It's the right idea, but not something that really worked for them. And eventually players just got tired and they were just kind of parking the bus anyways and sitting back with a flat 5 in midfield. It's like United have just become so used to and happy to sit back. And they were doing it last week against Bournemouth. They did it in the whole game against Juventus. And they just couldn't learn how to press correctly as a cohesive unit in time for the derby. Another suggestion as well, United probably may have benefited from playing more of a 5-3-2. Don't want to debate too much really, but if Mourinho wanted to go down the route where he wanted to make sure that one of his wing-backs was always staying tight to Sterling or Mahrez, having that extra centre-back, because we saw it a lot of the time anyways when Matic was trying to drop deep, but then because they were playing with the two wide players up front, that meant they had one less person centrally. So yeah, if you'd maybe have had a extra centre-back, that extra centre-back would have then given you that protection to allow the other two centre-backs to focus on covering the half space. Obviously when Man City players would sneak into the half space on the back of Aguero's movement, without having to worry about anything going on the other side. But at the same time, you can also argue that if that centre-back in the middle is more of a stopper, then you can have the two centre-backs carry on doing what they're doing, and that one in the middle, in terms of being a stopper, if you're not playing with a Fernandinho style of player who's sat between the midfield and the defence, who isn't man-marking but is just zonally marking that area to catch Aguero as he drops into that net, essentially, you can have that third central centre-back trying and push forwards and cover that anyways. So really, the idea behind that is not only to try and cover the half spaces, but also deal with the false nine. Like I said, another option with that is just playing a back four and, playing an anchor man. But with the 5-3-2, because they're not playing wingers, United have the extra play centrally. And I think, personally, it was quite evident after the first half that City wanted to force United wide. So I'm not quite sure why United kept insisting on trying to counter-attack through the wide areas. And I've said this before, and I'll say it again, Rashford isn't a winger. Martial isn't a winger. And it's just, the difference is night and day. When you see a player like Mahrez running down the wing versus looking at a player like Rashford or looking at a player like Martial, who are really converted strikers trying to run down the wings. But yeah, if United can, instead of trying to emphasise players down the wide areas, have that extra player centrally on top of the extra centre-back centrally, it'd probably help them cover, obviously, where most of City's danger is going to come from in terms of the playmakers, and also help them improve their ball retention. They'll have players closer to those centre-backs. They'll be able, because of the extra defender, the extra play central, they'll be able to play with a slightly higher line without worrying too much, help them retain the ball, and just, build attacks a little bit better, because the direct balls were as a result of United being so deep, and at times, even where it feels like you can counter-attack to a Lingard or a Rashford or a Martial, they were so far away because of the nature of the counter-attack that they just couldn't get the ball to them. And also trying to force Walker and Mendy central, which is naturally something that would have happened. I mean, it happened anyways a lot of the time, but it's quite... if United had that extra play centrally, and it was clear that a lot of the play was happening in the central areas, and that United had a numerical dominance centrally, it could have then forced one of the fullbacks to join in centrally as an inverted fullback, as we saw Delph do a lot last season, and that then could have actually made room for Rashford and Martial to run in behind the space that's basically left behind that fullback, as we discussed earlier on. Or it could even, if fit, allow a Young or a Shaw to then bomb into that negated space and provide a switch option or an overlapping option. But again, that's just me theorising. That's going to be it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully I didn't waffle on for too long. Hopefully you like the new format. And as always, thanks for watching. And remember to hit the like button and the subscribe button.